That's the only aim that we have for having this kind of dialogues, this kind of platforms, to make things better, because there is always a room for improvements. And the time that we are living are very particular times, and we really need uh, to find new ways of working, because this is not business as usual at all. And we really need to be very innovative and trying to find different ways of working and different ways of having the approach to what we got, to the SDGs, to the development, to the way we coordinate. So in that feeling, with that aim, dear friends, as I am mentioning, COVID-19 and its cascading impacts have brought to light what the 2030 Agenda had recognized 5 years earlier: the interlinkages and integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. Not only because we are globalized, but because our health is intrinsically connected with our food and our ecosystems. Our economies rely on us, and our institution and our planet, or and our institutions as well rely on us. We rely on our planet by nature for our very existence. Sadly, we have taken this self-evident truth for granted. Because of these interlinkages, and at times our lack of coherent and effective actions, the pandemic is impacting and often reversing progress across all SDGs. We cannot accept that, and we have to take a urgent different look to this. But we now know that we can achieve transformational action and accelerated progress if we tap on the synergies that result for the integrated nature of the SDGs and overcome the trade-offs. Therefore, these integration dialogues will focus on three cross-cutting themes: to explore the interlinkages of the current challenges and the SDGs in depth, and to identify ways to maximize the impact of policy measures. Our dialogue will be based on the most creative ideas emanating from you, the member states, and on the work of the Council's subsidiary bodies and the UN system. We are basically taking stock on how we are working differently, how we are working better. And we don't have any other space to do so. That's what is very relevant of having these dialogues, because we're going to take the stock of what we are changing, how better we are working. This first dialogue will address institutional strengthening, governance, inclusion, and the rule of law. It is led by UNDP, which has worked extensively on monitoring process and supporting implementation of SDG 16. So I welcome the ASG of UNDP to this. The second dialogue, it will be on June 3rd, will focus on building back better towards inclusive, sustainable, and just economies for recovery, redesigning the contract between people and planet, and will be led by ILO. The third dialogue on June 10 will focus on human well-being and capabilities, building back more resilient, healthy, equitable, and sustainable societies, and will be led by FAO. Dear colleagues, as I just mentioned, integrated policy frameworks are at the heart of realizing the 2030 Agenda. This is not by chance. Integrated strategies and policies are meant to break silos, to generate positive impacts and co-benefits in related sectors, to increase what I mentioned, the coordination among various actors, and instill multidimensional approaches. These approaches are crucial at a time when we look for sustainable and resilient recovery strategies that also set inclusive and effective paths toward the achievement of the 2030 Agenda. The Global Sustainable Development Report from 2019 highlighted, you will remember, some entry points where measures can have multiplying effects across the SDGs on a cross-cutting nature by building on the strong interlinkages within systems such as food or energy systems. Institutional strengthening, governance, inclusion, and the rule of law are among the actions that have cascading impacts across the SDG. Good governance, inclusive governance, and peaceful and right-based societies are conditions for progress on every single SDG. They are based on the same values that the UN stands for. They must be ensured in all contexts, despite the multiple obstacles they can face, from lack of capacities to various forms of conflicts or even corruption. Economic and Social Council was given the charter mandate to coordinate the work of the entire UN system, including the specialized agencies in the economic, social, health, cultural, educational, and related matters. So let's say ECOSOC has never been as relevant as it is today. And we are changing ECOSOC. And we are giving a life that ECOSOC has never had in the previous 75 years. And it's with great pride that we must say that. Maybe the fathers of the charter, for the very first time, will see ECOSOC really being this platform of discussion and really being this place for coordinating, for integrating policies, for giving the response to all the development system. It is a powerful role of ECOSOC which should be used to provide the solutions to the economic, social, health, and related global problems that the Charter speaks about. Let's make it a reality. We have it in our hands. COVID-19 represents one of these compelling global challenges that ECOSOC was created to address. And the UN system has been at the heart of the policy and operational response to COVID-19 and its impact. ECOSOC's role extends from setting priorities for global health, for the global health response, and advising on public health measures in countries, to leading myriad efforts to deploy, coordinate, analyze, and develop resources, initiatives, and frameworks at the national and international level to better respond to the pandemic's impacts and recover in a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient manner. ECOSOC's range of expert work through its functional commissions and expert bodies has also contributed by recommending policy and standards on how best to respond to the pandemic and encourage an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery. It is important for the members of ECOSOC and for the UN to hear to what all these entities have been doing, as I just mentioned, to continue achieving this goal, but especially how we're doing things differently, how we're working together with a fresh look to face the pandemic and continue in our path for development. This is one of the most relevant things because we are talking about the recovery of our societies. So this is very important that we have this kind of informal dialogues in order to transform our conclusions into actions, and especially in the most important, effective multilateralism is the one that changes people's lives on the field. If we don't have, we can have beautiful documents, we can have beautiful resolutions. If all those documents and all these discussions are not translated into real improvements of society lives, of community lives, there really, I will tell you, our work doesn't work. Dear colleagues, I am therefore delighted to be here today to start our discussions and learn from UN system and from the member states wide experience in dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I look forward as well to listening to your best practices regarding integrated policies, programs, and strategies for an equal, resilient, and sustainable recovery and towards the achievement of the SDGs. I believe our exchanges here and at the 2021 integration segment that will be held on July the 2nd will significantly contribute to improved coordination, impact, and coherence of the UN system, action to support our efforts to achieve the future we all want and leaving no one behind, and especially improving people's life during the recovery. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presence and for the great ideas that I am sure we are going to share all. Thank you so much. Well, saying so, I will give it is my pleasure And I thank very much the ASG, the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs, Mrs. Maria Francesca Spatolizano, for being with us. She will make a presentation of the main takeaways of the expert group meetings in preparation of the thematic reviews of the 2021 High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. ASG, thank you so much again. It's my pleasure having you with us this morning. You have the floor, madam.
Dear Ambassador Sandoval, dear Juan, likewise, it's a real pleasure to be with you and start this cycle. Excellent initiative indeed. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be with you in this occasion. This is the first of a series, as Ambassador Sandoval said, of dialogues in preparation for the integration segment in July. And these kind of exchanges will certainly ensure that the integration segment builds on the rich work of the UN system and ECOSOC subsidiary bodies to inject innovative ideas into the thematic reviews at the HLPF. We all know that considering the 2030 agenda as one indivisible whole is essential for making progress towards the SDGs. So the integrated lens of approaching the work of the UN system and its allies is fundamental to progress. Today and during the next two dialogues, member states and the UN system have a platform for advancing this discussion on the policies and programs that will support an equal, resilient, and sustainable recovery, as Ambassador Sandoval said, from COVID-19, and revamp the progress on the SDGs. Excellencies, in the past years, this year too, DESA, in collaboration with the EU and entities and external partners, is undertaking an extensive, substantive review process of the SDGs in preparation for the HLPF. And just about 2 weeks ago, a series of expert group meetings were held as part of this process. Experts from academia, civil society, the governments, and the UN system partners took a deep dive into the progress and challenges to achieving the 9 in focus SDGs, including through their interlinkages to the broader 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And there were over 150 participants in these experts meetings. They also focused on identifying what has changed for these SDGs since they were last reviewed in depth at the HLPF. We heard from them about additional challenges, of course, to achieving these goals in the context of the current situation, and how COVID-19 response and recovery efforts can contribute towards advancing them. And we are very honored that Ambassador Sandoval was there at the launch of these meetings. And let me now share some of their findings with you, because I believe they will indeed complement your own discussions. So first of all, obviously we face a much steeper road to the SDGs. Overall, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the challenges and prospects for the SDGs globally. But experts also made it clear, as you know, that even back in 2019, before the pandemic, we were not on track, at least not on all the goals. And the evidence is growing. In 2020, an additional 120 million people were pushed into extreme poverty, reversing progress towards SDG 1. The equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs were lost last year, and economic growth was negative across the world, of course, so SDG 8 related. And acute hunger as well has doubled, with protracted crisis, further raising the threats of food insecurity as per SDG 2. Second finding, inequalities remain deep and are actually rising. Experts noted the threat of rising inequalities both within and between countries, indicating that current trajectories could lead to distrust of institutions, unrest, even violence, with the most vulnerable people and countries bearing the brunt. Experts also drew attention to the ways in which new channels of inequality are opening up under COVID-19 that interact with ongoing trends, but also threaten to have long-lasting effects. For example, the unequal care burden faced by women, as well as increases in gender-based violence, is putting undue pressure on gender equality that may be difficult to recover from. And the digital divide is taking on new meaning as a generation of children without internet access and lost access to education and unequal access across countries to financing for recovery and to vaccines may widen and entrench gaps that were shrinking earlier. Third finding, our approaches to environmental preservation are far short of the needed interventions. Despite a temporary reprieve due to the pandemic, preliminary data shows that greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow in 2020 and that 2015-2020 was the warmest 6-year period on record. Domestic material consumption per capita and total global material footprint, as well as food waste and e-waste, all continue to rise around the world. Addressing this crisis will require major structural transformations in the way we live, people live, work, produce, and consume, of course. So, ladies and gentlemen, luckily, there are also some points of consensus about what needs to happen next, and this is urgent. First, there was a consensus that ending poverty and hunger, ensuring healthy lives, and creating decent jobs and livelihoods need not be viewed as incompatible with decarbonization and protection of natural resources. Indeed, technology and innovation can be harnessed to manage trade-offs and to respond to challenges. Second, during the cross-cutting sessions, a recurring message was that an integrated approach to the SDGs, grounded in knowledge and science, and inclusive of different voices, such as indigenous peoples, older populations, people with disabilities, and many others, is imperative to accelerate progress across the entire 2030 agenda. So the Global Sustainable Development Report from 2019 that you know well has already laid out a series of entry points through which pragmatic and collaborative action can be taken. Third, there was agreement also that collaboration and support both within and across countries was essential to reduce inequalities and for overcoming the COVID-19 crisis. Strengthened social protection systems and new social contracts would help. And also creating fiscal space would be necessary. I recall, in fact, one of the experts stating that for many countries, debt servicing payments were higher than expenditure on healthcare system, and that is not the right proportion. The discussions included a note of hope, observing that the pandemic recovery period may provide an unprecedented opportunity to overcome inertia and make the kind of large-scale and ambitious changes that are needed. Governments can, and in fact should, direct recovery investments towards renewable energy, sustainable infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and green jobs, as well as renewed commitment to international cooperation. The private sector can work to shift to sustainable production practices, and individuals and communities that are able may move towards lasting changes in their consumption patterns. Excellencies, the HLPF provides a unique opportunity to advance informed decision-making at a time of unprecedented challenges and to forge global solidarity and multilateral cooperation. I am pleased, and I am at the end of my presentation, that the expert group meeting we organized and the integration dialogues we are launching today will contribute to the evidence and knowledge base for the forum's discussions. This dialogue today and in the coming days can help to identify promising areas for driving transformation and SDG implementation that is based on your experiences and knowledge. And it can further guide the UN system in its work. I wish you a very successful meeting. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, HSG, thank you very much for your very inspiring words. You are really giving us a very good diagnostic on the situation of the world, but exactly is what we really want to see. I think that you are really raising topics that we have never raised before, and this is about these new approaches that we have to define and to share. So let me welcome, thank you so much, ESG. Let me welcome our moderator for this dialogue, Miss Sarah Cliff, the director of New York's University Center on International Cooperation. And so, Sarah, the floor is yours and the conduction of the meeting. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sandoval, and it was a pleasure to listen to your remarks and to ASG Spatalisano's remarks. I think that this event is truly important because, as you said in introducing, the impact of the crisis has been an integrated one, and we need integrated responses towards it. We all know that this is a health crisis that has become a socio-economic crisis. I would argue that it's now a crisis that is turning into a trust crisis. We saw that early in the pandemic, people's trust in governments actually went up. If we go back to April or May of last year, people realized to some extent, what do we need governments, what do we need international cooperation for? We need them to combat this sort of crisis. But we now see that that trust bubble has burst. And it's burst all over the world, in high-income countries, in middle-income countries, in low-income countries, for a number of reasons, I think, but reasons that are core to the purpose of this dialogue. Because people have seen slow progress on vaccination in many areas, and they've also seen vaccine inequity. Because they've seen that the socioeconomic impacts are not, in fact, shared. So we've seen the wealth of the world's billionaires over this period go from $5 trillion to $13 trillion, while at the same time, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have been pushed out of work, have lost homes, have had to migrate back to rural areas, have lost loved ones, have lost savings as they prepare for the future. So the rising inequality, which Maria Francesca referred to, is, I think, really key to this crisis of trust, and addressing it is going to be key to the crisis of trust. We have a chance in the recovery program to do that, but we should also perhaps be mindful of the lessons of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where to some extent the recovery program added to that decline in trust, because it was perceived as going more to the wealthy, more to some groups than to others, while being paid for in the long term by the poor. So the recovery program, rather than actually restoring a sense of unity, actually contributed to a sense of disunity. And here I think we have a chance to do better, but we have to focus on exactly the topics of this dialogue. We have to look at how the recovery programs can be seen to be clean, can be seen to be equitable, to be going to those who need help most, can be seen to improve equity within countries, but also between countries, including showing a strong financing for development response, which means that we don't have, as we go into the end of this year, a situation of COVID haves and COVID haves nots, where some countries are able to continue to mount strong social protection programs and other countries are not. So all these governance, equity, institutional issues, absolutely core to the credibility test we have now in restoring trust. We have a wonderful panel to talk about this. It's my pleasure, first of all, to introduce ASG Haoling Zhu. Haoling, of course, someone who has focused on governance, not only in his current role as director of UNDP's Bureau of Policy Support, but also in his previous work in the Asia region. I know someone who has been strongly committed always to ensuring governance in the work. UNDP institutionally has also been playing a very key role in supporting some of the new aspects of the SDGs that deal with institutions, governance, peace and justice. Haoling, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Ambassador Sandoval, for this invitation. On behalf of Mr. Akin Steiner, who unfortunately is in a meeting with a group of PRs, about our next strategic plan. So I have the privilege to speak a few words on his behalf. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, delivering on sustainable development goals is a formidable governance challenge for all countries. We know that it requires coordination, consultation, and collaboration across policy and sector areas, and from the global to the community level. The integrated whole of government and the whole of society approaches, which will ensure equitable and sustainable outcomes, require accountable, inclusive, and effective governance systems, as recognized in SDG 16. It requires integrating SDG 16 principles, the governance principles of inclusion, responsiveness, accountability, effectiveness, and the rule of law across all development policies, processes, and programming. As time is short, to illustrate what the integration means to us in practice, I would like to just mention briefly 3 areas of work that is central to UNDP's mandate, and to illustrate the issue of integration in governance. So the first is gender equality. So gender equality is at the core of inclusive and accountable governance. The COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on populations, governments, and economies, particularly in exacerbating gender inequalities, has underscored the importance of inclusive governance systems that address the needs of women and girls, particularly those facing multiple forms of discrimination. To create an enabling environment for women's full and equal participation, transformation of institutions and systems is needed. To make this a reality, UNDP is working with our host governments to strengthen constitutional, legislative, and policy frameworks, including through introducing temporary special measures and quotas to amplify women's voices and promote women's equal participation and leadership in all forms of decision-making, including in public institutions, parliaments, and the judiciary, as well as the CSOs, the private sector, and in COVID-19 task teams. To help spur change, UNDP has launched the Gender Seal for Public Institutions program to support a more integrated, more integral, more regular, and continuously monitored approach to address gender inequality. So this is the one. The second illustration I would like to use is our work on social protection. During the COVID-19 crisis, UNDP, together with ILO, UNICEF, FAO, and the World Bank, and our government certainly, has focused on the development of national social protection strategies and action plans, women-targeted cash transfers, and support to women-led businesses. In 2020, 1.8 million people directly benefited from UNDP's supported cash transfer programs, of whom 69% were women. However, development outcomes require an integrated approach to social protection, looking not just at the short-term cash payments. This is why UNDP also focused on the expansion of care systems, expansion of legal registration, financial inclusion, access to digital assets, and so forth. The third area is health systems and access to vaccines, as Sarah actually pointed out earlier. The last year has highlighted more starkly than ever that accountable, inclusive, and effective governance systems underpin equitable service delivery in the health sector and directly impact health outcomes. We have, for example, seen that the effects of corruption are felt across health service delivery, procurement practices, supply chain, and fund management. We continue to work closely with partners and countries to integrate anti-corruption measures in country health sectors and support efforts to build institutional transparency and accountability, including at the subnational level. In line with our focus on strengthening systems and governance to promote equity, resilience, and a sustainable recovery, we are also supporting country-level COVID-19 vaccination efforts in these areas, critical for building forward better. That includes digital solutions for vaccine delivery, green COVID-19 vaccination, and the data for vaccine equity. Granular, multidimensional, and real-time data is needed to support better decision-making for vaccine equity. UNDP is supporting countries to use hyper-local and multidimensional vaccine analytics to inform and drive greater equity in implementing national deployment and vaccination plans led by WHO and UNICEF. So before I finish, I would like to very quickly comment briefly on the need for a credible and well-designed national financing frameworks, which are key to mobilizing and steering public and private resources towards the objectives of integrated national development strategies. Progresses have been made in over 70 countries in developing integrated national financing frameworks, the INFFs, to mobilize and align finance to national priorities and the SDGs. This area of work is also a priority in order to unlock new forms of private and public financing towards the SDGs. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing and joining the discussions. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Hao-Liang, for highlighting, I think, a couple of crucial points. One is what you said about partnerships, that we are seeing approaches now that bring in new actors in much more innovative ways in order to respond to the crisis. And I was struck about how you spoke about alliances from parliamentarians to national and local government to CSOs on gender equity issues. The second is how you highlighted that, in a way, the crisis is accelerating the push under the SDGs to look at disaggregated data and disaggregated progress. That, of course, has always been fundamental to the difference between the SDGs and the MDGs. But I thought it was very interesting, the acceleration of looking at data that can actually show who is being included in health responses, for instance, and who is not. It's my pleasure now to turn to Ambassador Mer Margarian, Permanent Representative of Armenia and Chair of the Commission on the Status of Women. Ambassador Margarian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator. And I want to thank the Vice President, my colleague, Ambassador Mendiola, for inviting me to this integration dialogue and to present the main highlights of the 65th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which I had the privilege to chair. I am no longer the chair, but I used to be for the 64th and the 65th sessions. Dear colleagues, despite the impact of the pandemic on the working modalities of this session, the Commission brought together a wide range of stakeholders from governments of member states, civil society, women's organizations, national human rights institutions, media, and private sector. The 65th session of the Commission resulted in a strong and consensual outcome, which sent an important message on the imperative to address the needs of all women and girls in response and recovery policies and programs ensure upholding and promoting their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and meaningful participation and engagement in all areas of public life. At its 65th session in March, the CSW considered the priority theme women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, and paid particular attention to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls. Various aspects of the priority theme were addressed during the discussions of the ministerial roundtables and interactive dialogues. The ministerial roundtables focused on the exchange of good practices towards achieving women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life and creating an enabling environment to that end. The three interactive dialogues put the emphasis on the topics of eliminating violence against women in public life, building alliances for women's full and effective participation and leadership in COVID-19 response and recovery efforts. In its consensually adopted agreed conclusions, the Commission expressed concern that the COVID-19 pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women and girls and is deepening pre-existing inequalities that perpetuate multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. It recognized that the pandemic has further exacerbated vulnerabilities in women's and girls' social and economic situations, including their access to essential health care services and to education, as well as their safety, well-being, and livelihood. Girls have been particularly at risk of dropping out of and not returning to schools, according to the statistic made recently available. These disproportionate impacts on the lives of women and girls compound existing obstacles to women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life. In response to these challenges, the Commission emphasized the critical role that women play in the pandemic response, as well as in recovery and growth efforts. It stressed the need to strengthen the full and equal meaningful participation and leadership of women, including women with disabilities, in all stages of response and recovery efforts. Further, it recognized the need to ensure women's access to decent work, just and favorable work conditions, including living wages and universal access to social protection supported by national strategies, policies, action plans, and adequate resources. To mitigate the impact of the pandemic on women and girls, the Commission came up with action-oriented recommendations aimed at strengthening gender-responsive institutional reforms in COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, and called on governments at all levels and stakeholders to take appropriate measures, such as increasing women's leadership in those efforts, including through gender balance in task forces, standing committees, or other decision-making bodies, promoting participation of members of women's organizations in decision-making processes, promoting women's entrepreneurship and strengthening women's participation in economic activity, creating safe, enabling, and violence-free working environment for women, especially the frontline workers. Among other important recommendations of the Commission was the call to develop response and recovery plans that promote sustainable development, drive transformative change towards inclusive and just societies by inter alia targeting women and girls. The Commission underlined that the economic response, including poverty eradication measures, social assistance and protection, and fiscal and stimulus packages should be equally accessible to all, and specifically address women's and girls' disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work. It also stressed the need for measures to ensure equal pay for work of equal value, including in the public health sector, where women are the vast majority of the frontline health and social workers and are significantly engaged in the delivery of essential and public services. Mr. Vice President, Madam Moderator, distinguished colleagues, highlighting the role of the United Nations, the Commission called on the UN system to continue to mainstream a gender-responsive perspective in COVID-19 response and recovery measures. The 2030 Agenda confirms the centrality of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls to the sustainable development and poverty eradication, and for progress across all SDGs and targets. It envisages a world in which every woman and girl enjoys full gender equality until legal, social, and economic barriers to their empowerment have been removed. In many countries, including my own country, Armenia, the potential of women's equal and meaningful participation in public life is yet to be fully realized. We need to recommit ourselves to creating a conducive environment for empowerment of women in decision-making processes, including in political leadership. We must work to ensure that women, national gender equality mechanisms, and women organizations are included in planning, decision-making, and implementation of pandemic response and recovery measures, and that such measures are gender responsive. In this second year of Decade of Action for Delivery of Sustainable Development Goals, concerted actions to implement the 2030 Agenda in a gender responsive manner needs to be accelerated to achieve the full gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by 2030. The imperative of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls should remain as key priority in the work of ECOSOC system, particularly when we are embarking on efforts to recover from pandemic and build back better. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, both for highlighting the very diverse impacts on women and girls, from access to healthcare, education, safety, well-being, and livelihoods, to looking now at the opportunity for how can we use this moment to accelerate progress on a vision of gender equity. It's my pleasure to hand now to Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, someone whose own life and career does illustrate the engagement of strong women in public life. Geraldine is now Chancellor of the Nelson Mandela University and Chair of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, but she has served in the African Development Bank, in the United Nations, and of course in her own country, in government and in political leadership. Geraldine, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to be here, and good to be with people I haven't seen for a very long time as well. As I engage in this discussion and building on the inputs that you have made, Sarah, as moderator, and the interventions by all other speakers who've come before, I mean, it's not let me say unpredictable that there will be commonalities, and I will draw this through and base it on some of the work that we've seen as the Committee of Experts, as well as experience from South Africa and elsewhere in the world as well. And so the one obvious statement that I will make that's linked to what are some of the transformative legal policy and institutional measures to break down policy responses, I will refer to the strategy guidance note. That points to the fact that a fundamental premise of policy coherence is that there are interlinkages and mutual dependencies in the 2030 agenda, and that these interactions take place between the agenda's different policy domains. I mean, it's also one thing that has come through very clearly and strongly, that you cannot look at the implementation of any of the sustainable goals without SDG 16, looking at building strong institutions and looking at the whole issue of rule of law, peace, etc. But what is even more is that we've seen with the onset of the pandemic in 2020, as you have pointed out earlier, Sarah, and I think it's come up from others as well, that what has been seen as a health crisis has become a socioeconomic crisis. But what's more was initially with the onset of this crisis, there was almost a great focus on and a re-look at the role of governments, the public service, the importance of the state. And this was acknowledged both from public and the private sector and civil society as a whole. And it was a moment where public servants were also refocused upon, where we looked at people in particular in care work. And I'm not only talking about unpaid care work, but you looked at health workers, you looked at what has been referred to by members of the Committee of Experts of Public Service and Administration, almost the invisible or unsung workers, those who were cut back during particular periods when there was a view that there's a need to roll back the impact of the state and public service and public administration. And we saw it as an opportunity for public administration and government to reassert itself. But sadly, as you pointed out as well, and this was a point that came up at our 2021 session, there's also been a crisis of trust. And it was more a crisis of trust in leadership. So elected leadership. And that in itself has quite a knock-on effect as well. And we need to look at what are the lessons out of this. Because if we want to attain the SDGs, and we are very clear that an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic requires the acceleration of administrative and governance reforms in all countries in order to increase government's capability to address short and long-term challenges and to improve their resilience to economic, social, and environmental shocks. So to deal with this, we've got to ensure that the center holds. And we've got to look at how that happens. So there is a common tension, and this is understood in public administration, between responding to urgent and important needs and at the same time attempting to deliver on longer term policy objectives. So in terms of crisis, people tend to focus on the short term and forget about the long term. And this was the issue that I believe was raised both by the ambassador as well as the ASG, who spoke about the importance of not overlooking the role of the attainment of the SDGs in this moment, this time of a pandemic, in spite of a particular focus to get things right. I think this also takes us to a point, a very critical and important point of solidarity and the importance of the UN system as a whole. And I'll come back to that. But before I proceed on that, I want to conclude on the sustainable development and strengthening resilience part. The achievement thereof requires a long-term perspective in policy making, together with institution building at all levels. And this is based on effective governance, resilient governance for sustainable development, and a steadfast commitment to promoting peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So we've heard Hao Ling talk about a whole of society, whole of government intervention, and this is what it's about, you know. We need to be clear that each country, whatever the context, needs to do serious work to understand the connections between policy domains and investing in capacities to move towards greater coherence in the longer term. So again, as I said, nothing new, but it's almost become more urgent with the current situation in which we find ourselves. And there are methods for this, with support available from international and regional organizations. And I'm not going to sort of go on to that a lot more. So let me come back to the solidarity issue. And I'm going to link that to the whole issue of vaccines. And it's an issue that we've raised as well. And I'm going to deal with it more broadly and then in a regional context, and I'll try to be brief. I've spoke about the necessity for governments to play a proactive leading role to break past trends of replacing public institutions with private ones. And all over the world, governments are trying to reinvent themselves for collaborative leadership in a whole of government and a whole of society approach. I've touched on the lack of trust and won't deal with that, but do want to just emphasize the need of the principle of leaving no one behind. So on this issue of solidarity, I think this is a time when the world desperately needs cooperation and collaboration. I think there's no question about it. And this is not only among researchers working for competing vaccine developers, but also amongst governments who can and must end the disparity that's been referred to, the fact that we are seeing vaccine inequity. So data is available as to where the bulk of vaccines that have been developed is right now. And the reality is that it is not reaching everyone. And in a workshop that was held in Africa in around April this year, there were some major takeaways that I would like to share. And this was a workshop that was pulled together across the number of countries. And they said, and I quote, that COVID-19 vaccine financing, procurement and distribution in Africa should include without significant external and domestic resources allocated to the vaccine in the developing world, we risk COVID-19 becoming yet another poor country disease. So we should look at it. I mean, it is a global reality, but it could become that. And also the fact that uncertainties associated with COVID-19 vaccine programs require unusual degrees of budgetary flexibility, which must be accompanied by even greater levels of transparency and accountability. So that's important. And that supply constraints necessitate that countries procure from multiple manufacturers, and so it goes on. But it also brings us, and I'm going to conclude on that, on a greater debate, and that's where the World Trade Organization needs to play a role. And I think you know where I'm leading to, and that's the issue of TRIPS. So just want to say that these are all issues that had come up, and I want to endorse the issue that was raised around the undue impact of women and how they've been forced out of the economy because of care responsibility, and even more so during this period. So thank you very much, Sarah, and sorry that I've gone over time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. You made some points that are absolutely crucial to this debate. So I think looking at the opportunity of refocusing government, ensuring that the centre holds, getting the balance between short-term responses and long-term issues right, and where you ended on the solidarity questions internationally, both in terms of vaccine equity and some of the innovations on property, intellectual property rights, for instance, that may take us towards. as well as on budget flexibility, where there is also a very large disconnect between countries that can mount a large budget response and those who cannot in this situation. It's my pleasure now to hand to Ms. Anne Worgam, the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, PFII. And we look forward very much to hearing your remarks both on the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples and the role that Indigenous peoples are playing in responses on peace, justice, inclusion, and institutional strengthening. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues held its 20th session in a hybrid format in April. The thematic focus, peace, justice and strong institutions, the role of Indigenous peoples in implementing SDG 16 was carried over from 2020. Similar to other subsidiary bodies, the Permanent Forum framed within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the lives of Indigenous peoples. In December 2020, DESA, in response to a recommendation of the Permanent Forum, organized an expert group meeting on Indigenous peoples and pandemics. The recent forum session highlighted how pre-existing inequalities have been exacerbated by ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It laid bare that in many countries, Indigenous peoples' inadequate access to culturally appropriate healthcare, sanitation, digital infrastructure, to access education, social protection, and access to markets left them even more vulnerable during COVID-19. These circumstances have led to disproportionately high infection and mortality rates among Indigenous peoples in many countries. However, the Permanent Forum also heard that where Indigenous peoples have been able to exercise their self-determination, they organize their own responses to the pandemic. They have relied on and revitalized traditional medicines and practices, established efficient alternative communication systems in their Indigenous languages, shared food supplies, and established procedures for lockdowns. Where these initiatives were supported by the state, they were even more successful in effectively reaching Indigenous peoples. The Forum noted that the non-discriminatory delivery and administration of vaccines is a key issue in recovery plans and efforts. However, on the issue of the recovery plans and building back better, the Forum also seized with the increasing threats to Indigenous lands, territories, and resources that have only increased during COVID-19 lockdowns. Further, the violence and killings of Indigenous human rights defenders is on the rise in many, many countries. The Forum noted that relaxing of environmental and human rights standards with the view of the promotion of economic growth, such as logging, mining, large-scale agriculture, and various infrastructure and energy projects, they threaten Indigenous peoples' territories. We Indigenous peoples fear that in rush to build back economies post-COVID-19, the lure of financial resources to be made by further exploitation of Indigenous lands will increase. This will lead to increased poverty, inequality, and food insecurity, violence against Indigenous women and girls, and limited access to justice. Therefore, even more than ever, respect for free, prior, and informed consent and support for Indigenous peoples to engage with the private sector if they wish and on their own terms is crucial. After all, a respect for free, prior, and informed consent is part of building trust between Indigenous peoples, member states, and UN agencies and programs. The concept of building back better also implies opportunities to recognize and value the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples in safeguarding and conserving the environment, actions which can significantly advance the achievement of sustainable development goals. Indigenous peoples offer a solution to many of urgent crises facing the world. Indigenous peoples' management of their lands, territories, and resources is not only good for the environment and biological diversity, but it is also important and essential for maintaining international peace and security. And the interlinkages are becoming more apparent. The Permanent Forum emphasizes that climate change is an increasing driver for insecurity, exacerbating conflicts over lands, territories, and resources. Member states and the United Nations system should look to indigenous peoples as partners to address possible solutions in situations of conflict. Effective responses to the pandemic and recovery measures need to be collaborative effort between indigenous institutions and state institutions. Combining indigenous knowledge of what is best for indigenous peoples with state services and financial support will ensure effective and long-term positive outcomes. As I have said, for indigenous peoples, there are many cross-cutting issues, but the issue of autonomy and self-governance, strong institutions, peace and security, and access to justice ensures the preservation of their culture and management of indigenous lands, territories, and resources. However, we continue to work both within and outside the UN system to raise awareness of the benefits to society in fulfilling these rights. The Forum continues to engage through ECOSOC with other subsidiary bodies and a high-level political forum to bring the benefits of indigenous knowledge into discussions of biodiversity, climate change, food security, peace and security, governance, and the preservation of sustainable natural resources. We see ECOSOC as the nexus to make those linkages and to break silos between its functional and advisory bodies on the path to post-COVID recovery. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Anne, for laying out in such a compelling way the disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples of the pandemic, but also how people are drawing on their traditional strengths and innovations to look at recovery. I thought you ended also on 2 points that are very important: the long-term risk of tensions over land use exacerbated by climate change, which is of course an issue that is very important for Indigenous peoples, but has a much wider societal importance as well, and the role of ECOSOC as the nexus to bring together some of these linkages. I'm going to go now to our first speakers. I would encourage everyone who wants to take the floor to please inscribe yourself in the list through the link that has been provided. I will go first to Assistant Secretary General Najat Mialamid, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. I then have the representative of Colombia, and then Mr. Peter Mayer, the Chair of the Commission on Science and Technology for Development. Najat, over to you.
Thank you so much. I will be short. I just want to, in addition to what was told, that we need also to pay particular attention to children. And when I'm speaking about children, it's from their birth to 18 years, reminding, you know, that many inequalities were affecting children before the pandemic. And also what is important, violence against children in all its form was also affecting many children before the pandemic. Just to the numbers, 50% of children experience violence every year. You know, somewhere in the world, a child is killed every 7 minutes is killed by violence, just to keep it in mind. And it was before the COVID. And with the COVID, and all of us, we know that it exacerbated and magnified inequalities, children poverty, hunger, but also violence both online and offline. And the socioeconomic impact will increase all forms of violence, exploitation, trafficking, smuggling, and other. Another point that we saw is also mental health that was duly impacted during the COVID pandemic. The pandemic. Another point that we see also a rise of detention of migrants, of children on streets during the pandemic. But we saw also good initiatives that we need to build on. And I want to focus on that. One is strengthening the child welfare service, the child reporting mechanism, justice, and social protection. And I think these integrated services we need to build on the lessons learned to make sure that they are part of the national socio-economic recovery plan, including education, health, mental health, justice, child protection, and sustainable social protection, reaching the most vulnerable. Another point that I want to highlight, it will be my last point, is to make sure that children are seen as drivers of change. And what we saw, many wonderful examples. They are providing peer-to-peer supporting, very involved in implementing SDGs, in providing psychosocial support, in raising awareness through ICTs, but also what is important to bridge the digital divide, they were reaching, through an offline process such as caravan radio to reach the most vulnerable. The two message, please pay attention to children. We have not to make them forgotten, and in the same time seeing them as driver of change. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think indeed this is a crisis where children and youth have sacrificed for the rest of society, and the recovery needs to be there as it needs to benefit them and be driven by them. Representative of Colombia.
Thank you very much. We wanted to take the opportunity to share the views of many of the panelists that have provided us with key messages regarding the main issues that right now we need to address in the context of the decade of action and results, and of course under the context of facing the COVID-19 pandemic impacts. And we wanted to take the opportunity also to leave on the table some key messages and ideas that from Colombia's perspective should be taken into account in order to advance and keep reinforcing and strengthening the ECOSOC, which we believe that plays a critical role in leading all of us in addressing these particular challenges. First of all, we of course share the views of Mr. Ambassador Sandoval. Of course, the best roadmap that we have already to face the COVID-19 pandemic is the 2030 agenda, and we need to advance actually in the complete and comprehensive implementation of the agenda and avoid these silo reviews of the SDGs in order to be able to actually recover and build back better also in the progress of these relevant SDGs that have been hit tremendously by the pandemic. We face even greater challenges right now in eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, in combating inequality and injustice, in achieving gender equality, and for confronting climate change. And we are sure that we will not be able to build back better and, of course, achieve once again our progress and the SDGs without taking into account the different interlinkages between them and mobilizing all relevant actors around relevant initiatives for their implementation. We wanted to also address very quickly the issue of health, social protection, and vaccines. We do believe that it is necessary to coordinate and strengthen national, regional, and global capacities and increase the production and supplies of vaccines. Intersectional workforce is essential. The scientific, industrial, and commercial health sectors must work jointly and on comprehensive strategies to promote the local production of vaccines, medicines, and all kinds of tools. And likewise, the distribution of these technologies and tools must be given without restrictions to ensure that the generation of gaps in access between countries is avoided. The financial mechanisms will also play a critical role in addressing all these needs. We need to ensure that recovery packages remain sustainable without generating additional pressures on the loss of biodiversity and climate change. The protection of nature should remain as a relevant criteria for the portfolio of loans and grants of these financial mechanisms. And it is also, of course, important that the official development assistance is not reduced, and on the contrary, it must be strengthened, taking into account also the commitments of the agenda, of the action agenda of Addis Ababa. Finally, we would like to stress that of course, fiscal policy is key in this regard to generate not only resources for public spending, but also to support the reduction of inequalities through transparent and predictable fiscal regulations. We need to really make an effort to close the gap between the expenditure that is maybe harmful for nature and the expenditure that actually can promote nature-based solutions. So these are ideas that we believe that ECOSOC, as a governing and leader body to promote standards and policies on the ground, can take into account, also with the view of avoiding duplication and strengthening the coordination between its subsidiary bodies. Thank you very much. And we commend this relevant preparatory dialogue and the ones to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for highlighting those practical suggestions also for ECOSOC's role. I have the last speaker is Mr. Peter Mayer, the Chair of the Commission on Science and Technology for Development. And then I'd like to go back to the panel just for 1 minute each to reflect, if we can, before passing back to the Vice President of ECOSOC. Mr. Mayer.
Thank you, Sarah. I will be very brief. I just want to say that the CSTD concluded its 24th session and recommended to rely on SDI for recovery from COVID-19 and to accelerate the achievements of the SDGs as well. We also emphasized the need for cooperation, as has been mentioned by many of you, and in particular in digital cooperation as outlined in the Secretary General's digital agenda. Now, the digital divide has been very crucial in the COVID-19 period, and it's still a very crucial element. It is one of the main concerns also in the recovery, and in particular, the connection to internet has been identified as one of the major setbacks, which is still not available for half of the world's population. And in particular, I have to mention also the gender divide in accessing the internet itself, which is widening. Well, probably these are not new things, but everything has come to focus during this pandemic. And as you mentioned, Sarah, one of the main things is confidence building, because as you said, we are in a crisis. We are really in a trust crisis. And this is one of the main tasks for us, all of us. Now, finally, I'm really confident with the introduction of Ambassador Juan Sandoval with the new role or the new mandate of the ECOSOC to cooperate, to help to cooperate among the UN bodies. This is extremely important, and I think during the next two dialogues we can talk about this, the means, how we can cooperate better. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Very important points also on the role of ECOSOC, but also about digital connectivity, which has gone up the radar screen of everyone's attention during this crisis. I'd like to go back to the panel briefly, if I can, just ask you to restrict perhaps to 1 minute of reflections on what you've heard. First, over to you, Herle.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I really appreciate, as Vice President of ECOSOC, to organize this discussion. Two quick points. One is what Sarah, you mentioned, is a question of trust for governance. Really, I think at the end of the day, governance is there to deliver an outcome. If the outcome serves the interest of people, the women, girls, indigenous people, and others who are vulnerable, and there will be trust. So I think this really is the purpose of governance systems. The second point is really what Geraldine mentioned, the coherence of policy domains across different issues. The fact that is that any issue we pick up today, they are multidimensional. Nothing can be solved by one sector alone. I think so. The coherence issue is really important. And in this regard, again, the capacity issue that she touched on. If we change just our mindset on how we approach these questions, if we work with our, constituencies, stakeholders together rather than top down and so forth, and asking the question why, what's the purpose of what we try to achieve, and you will immediately see, the difference in how we can solve the problem. The capacity is there, in fact. The issue is mindset and approach. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hanyang. We actually have one request for the floor from Sepal Eclat, so I'd like to go very quickly to them, and then I will come back to Geraldine and Anne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the panel members, because they have been so inspiring. And I would like to highlight the importance of open government policies and practices at all state powers and levels of the government. When systematic channels of citizen participations are open and there is a convergence between public and private interests, this enhances building public policy agendas that underpins the power of all stakeholders' collaboration in response to all these complex public problems, such as this pandemic that we're now discussing. It also enhances modern, efficient, and sustainable and inclusive public management, and this is what Madam Fraser was referring to, and I felt really and deeply identified with that. Trust between state institutions and citizens, and finally, of course, increasing in the quality of democracy. So open government, which is based in three pillars of participation, accountability, collaboration, between citizens and government institutions, also advocate a significant increase of transparency, access to information, and accountability, which in light of the pandemic is crucial to ensuring that response and recovery resources are used efficiently and effectively. So the result from almost a decade of open government plans, action plans, which is something so concrete and enhances the participation of all stakeholders at the national and local levels. So from 2011 to this date, 51 national action plans have been implemented in Latin America, and more than 1,100 commitments linked to the principles of an open government. And
the point is very important on the open government action plans. It might be something perhaps Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi that you could take up in your reflections too. Can I turn to Geraldine?
Thank you very much. I think absolutely right. The points that had come through around open government, we see as quite key and forms part of the principles that are, let me call it universal, much as its application is context specific. So point taken. And I think the big challenge, and that's to you, Sarah, and to ECOSOC, is to look at how you pull together what has come before you, not only today, but through the various deliberations that have come up. So I'm going to conclude with one point, and that's the fact that the ECOSOC system should look at questions of integration in the same way that countries do. So, for example, by using methods and tools that have been developed, and as a committee of experts on public administration, we also have guidance notes that have been developed by specific experts, if I can put it that way. And there is a guidance note on promotion of integrated policy making And this is to study interlinkages and levels of policy coherence in priority areas and building capacity for the longer term. And it's on that note that I simply want to say, you know, there's the points raised today, the issues around women and leaving no one behind, the importance of institution building, the question of public trust. We cannot emphasize it too much. And I think the big issue is for all of us to come together and just make it happen, make the difference required.
Thank you, Geraldine. You summed that up perfectly in terms of what the challenge for everyone now is. Anne, over to you for your reflections.
Thank you. As Ambassador Sandoval stated, the trust bubble has burst. And there has been lots of talk about building back better and addressing the severe inequalities that the pandemic has made clear when it comes to the indigenous peoples. And when we are building back better, we have to go beyond the lip service. And as was stated by Ambassador and Sandoval, that we have to start about actual, real actions, real improvements, and to improve the inequalities within the countries. And when we are doing that, indigenous peoples have to have voices in all decisions that affect us. And that means that the rights of the indigenous peoples has to be recognized, such as the right to self-determination and our rights to our collective rights to lands, territories, and natural resources. And of course, our knowledge, our traditional knowledge. And so these rights must be respected, both at the country level and at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for summing up in that way. Before handing back to Ambassador Sandoval, who will close the meeting, I wanted to reflect quickly on a few takeaways I think came from the discussion. This was a really rich discussion. I have to say I was fascinated to have not only our speakers from UNDP, but the chairs of the different bodies come together and reflect on how their work and discussions has affected this challenge. I thought that 4 points came out of it: a kind of immediate credibility bar for institutions and governance, a second set of opportunities that may come from the crisis, an issue of the balance between national and international governance action, and the role of ECOSOC. And I know Ambassador Sandoval will pick up on the last. On the credibility bar, we have, as we have said, as Anne just said in closing, seen the trust bubble burst. So to restore that, there is a need really to focus on institutions delivering tangible outcomes to people, as Xiaoliang framed it, and to see that they do it in a way which is perceived as being clean, not corrupt, and equitable, not giving favors to some groups of people over others or excluding others. This to me seems the basic credibility bar to restore trust. And the speakers went through a number of really fascinating opportunities that I think could come out of the crisis. First is the game-changing nature of the crisis for the principle of leaving no one behind and looking at disaggregated welfare, not average welfare, but really welfare for each specific set of groups, each individual. The second, the need to refocus the role of government and the possibility of accelerating action and governance reforms because of what the crisis has told us is needed from government and because of the rise in demand for changed governance. Accelerate reforming critical sectors. So, for instance, the care economy, absolutely crucial for women and girls, looking at the lessons of the crisis for digital connectivity and accelerating progress on equitable digital access. Looking also at risks ahead. So what are the resilient institutions that we need to prepare for the next crisis? How do we look ahead at some of the predictable risks, such as the links between climate and land, which need to be addressed? And last, going through the entry point perhaps of looking at children, both as having sacrificed during this crisis and being actors in the recovery in all dimensions. The third point is on the national and international balance, that I think we talk a lot about the national social contract in restoring trust, but many of the speakers today talked about the international aspects of that. Vaccine equity, access to financing for development, and budget flexibility. And I think it's very important to underline that it's hard to renew national institutions and governance without that international support. And on the role of ECOSOC, there was a very, very strong support, I think, for the role that ECOSOC is now starting to play on coherence and integration, for strengthening that in future. And some questions about the role in looking at new norms and standards that come out of the crisis and drawing on some of the expert practice in the different commissions that has been developed in governments themselves. Ambassador Sandoval, it's been a great honor and pleasure. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to moderate this segment, and I turn over to you to close.
On the contrary, dear Sarah, thank you so much for such a splendid dialogue. I think that this is a great beginning of a new way of working at ECOSOC with the always desired coherence and coordination that we have always saw that there was a pending issue, a pending task for the UN. We have been talking 20 years about one UN and deliver as one, and it's a permanent challenge because it's huge. The UN is huge. The bodies are in different places around the world, but today we are making a difference. And let's say it clearly. What we have done this morning, we have break the silos. We are breaking the silos. The silos are broken this morning, and we are having the heads of different subsidiary bodies of ECOSOC exchanging views on topics that normally that they won't normally do it. So I am more than pleased that this is maybe one of the first conclusions of this morning. We are really breaking the silos. I would like to thank our lead entity, the UNDP, to you, Sarah, really for this splendid conduction, and our distinguished panelists, and all of you for participating in this very first integration dialogue. We are very motivated for the following ones. As we saw, we are living extraordinary times and facing challenges that can only be overcome if we act together in an coordinated, in an integrated way. The pandemic demonstrated how interconnected we are. What started as a health crisis turned, as it was said, into a socioeconomic turmoil, threatening our progress towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It has been an enlightening dialogue with very rich contributions from the perspective of your respective entities and also countries. We have covered a full scope of issues, highlighting the richness of the work of the ECOSOC system and the entities. As it was mentioned, it's a great opportunity of doing things differently. Let's do it. Just let's do it. We don't have to think much more about it. We also heard about the challenges faced by the countries in the wake of the pandemic and how they are trying to respond to this unprecedented socioeconomic impacts. We are all aware of the urgency to stop the pandemic and to alleviate its negative impacts on people, especially on the most marginalized. We have this dimension of the most vulnerable groups. They leave no one behind, making it a reality. Unfortunately, we didn't have the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. It was my intention of having the human rights dimension because it's cross-cutting all over the agenda, because when we talk about people, we must talk always about human rights, because it goes hand in hand, human rights and people situations. Thank you so much for talking about access to vaccines. The phrase is, there is no possible recovery without vaccines. And there is nothing more clear than that. If we want to recover, if we want to get back on track for the 2030 Agenda, we really need to have access to vaccines in every single country in the world for every single person. And it's an enormous challenge that the international communities facing, and we have to find solutions to this. To this, the strong, effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, the governance and the rule of law that was the topic of today's meeting are the prerequisites of an effective and inclusive recovery from the pandemic as well, and for the implementation of Agenda 2030. You talk very, very fine about trust, this lack of trust, and I think is very relevant to SDG 16, is very relevant to Sarah, to the group of friends of SDG 16. It was mentioned by Geraldine, fantastic presentations, both Geraldine, thank you very much, on the effective governance, the resilient governance, and especially those elements that we have in our hands. How are we going to ensure the trust of the people in the government? Of course, you said the vaccines access is one of the elements, but also the open governments, very important element, and also accountability and transparency in the way governments are working. Those are essential elements that must be a permanent element to be considered for the new world that we are building together. Transparency, accountability, open governments, to renew the trust in the institutions and then the rule of law, and also, of course, human rights is a permanent element. Thank you so much to the special representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, that she jumped with a very good participation. You gave us this dimension on human rights and the dimension of children that is absolutely essential to take into consideration. But well, saying so, our reflection through this dialogue will provide us with important input for the integration segment. The Secretary General personally told me that for the time being, there was nothing more important to that ensure integration and coordination. And I think that these dialogues, they go in this direction. The outcome of the integration dialogue will be a concise note identifying the key integrated policy options to put us back on track for the 2030 agenda and the SDG. So saying so, I really thank you so much. I am very pleased on the results that we are already having. I invite you to the next two informal dialogues. The second integration dialogue will be in 1 week. Will be on building back better towards inclusive, sustainable, and just economies for recovery, or this economic dimension that is very important, and to redesign the contract between people and planet. That is something that we have been always talking in recent times, that the Secretary General addressed a few months ago. And well, I really hope to see you there. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you so much, dear Sarah Cliff, for this splendid, really, conduction of this dialogue. And see you next week. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sandoval. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sandoval. Thank you, Sarah, and everyone online.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you for such an excellent discussion.